The night air in Atlanta was thick with music, lights, and the low rumble of engines from cars that looked like they belonged in music videos. The city pulsed with a rhythm all its own, and at the center of it all was a figure who seemed larger than life. Demetrius, Big Meech, Flenory didn't need to be a rapper, an athlete, or an actor to be famous, his name alone commanded attention. He moved through nightclubs like a star, surrounded by beautiful women, followed by a crew dressed in designer clothes, and trailed by whispers that spoke of millions of dollars and a street empire so vast it was almost unbelievable. There was a calm confidence about him, the kind that didn't need to shout to be heard. He could be seen in VIP sections, sipping champagne as if he had all the time in the world, his presence a quiet reminder that power doesn't always need to raise its voice. Atlanta in the early 2000s was a perfect backdrop for someone like Meech. The city had become the beating heart of Southern hip-hop, a place where music moguls and hustlers often crossed paths, where a night out could mean brushing shoulders with future legends. The strip clubs, the parties, the booming rap scene, it all played into the rise of a man who wanted more than money. Big Meech wasn't just building a criminal empire, he was building a brand, a lifestyle that blurred the line between underworld power and mainstream fame. People talked about him with a mix of awe and curiosity. Was he really the biggest drug kingpin in America? Could he really be moving hundreds of kilos a month while living so publicly? It was hard to believe, and yet the clues were everywhere, the caravans of luxury cars, the massive cash spending, the crowds that gathered just to watch him arrive. To see Meech in those days was to witness the very image of what many called the street dream. He didn't hide from the world. Instead, he embraced the spotlight, smiling for photos, shaking hands with rappers, and appearing at parties that seemed to last until sunrise. And yet, behind the glittering image, there was always something just slightly out of reach, a sense of mystery that made him even more fascinating. He rarely gave interviews. He spoke carefully, never saying more than he needed to. It was as if he knew that the more people speculated, the more his legend would grow. But the story of Big Meech isn't just about champagne and celebrity friends. It is a story that begins far from the flashing lights of Atlanta, a story rooted in the cold streets of Detroit, where two brothers started with almost nothing and built something that would shake the entire country. It is a story about ambition, not the kind that settles for survival, but the kind that dreams of empires. It is also a story about consequences, because every rise carries within it the seeds of its fall. For all his charisma and charm, for all the admiration he inspired, Big Meech was running an operation that was being watched by federal agents who were piecing together every move. And that is where the tension lives, in the space between the myth and the reality, between the man living like a superstar and the man who knew the walls were slowly closing in. For the listeners tonight, this is not just another gangster story. This is a journey into the rise of one of the most legendary figures in American crime history, told with the calm of a storyteller sitting by a fire, guiding you through each twist and turn. You will walk through Detroit in the 1980s, feel the grind of the streets, witness the first sparks of Meech and Terry's partnership, and follow them as they rise from corner boys to the heads of a nationwide network. You will see the glamorous nights of Atlanta when BMF ruled the clubs, and you will sit in the quiet of a courtroom when Meech faced the weight of his choices. Tonight, you'll be pulled into a world that feels both distant and strangely familiar, a world where loyalty and betrayal dance side by side, where ambition shines bright but burns hot. The story will move slowly, like a calm river, carrying you deeper into the legend of Big Meech until you find yourself wondering, what would I have done, standing where he stood? Would I have walked away when I had enough, or would I have wanted more, just like he did? For now, imagine Atlanta's streets on a warm night. The cars line up outside the club, chrome spinning, music rattling the pavement. Inside, the air is thick with cologne, perfume, and cigar smoke. Meech is there, sitting back, quiet, smiling, the boss who doesn't need to raise his voice to command the room. People watch him with respect, fear, admiration, and maybe even a little envy. He is a man who turned the underworld into a stage, a man whose name will echo long after the music fades. What you're about to hear is not just a crime story. It is a story about a dream so big it couldn't stay hidden, about a man who wanted to be both king and star, and who learned that every crown carries a price. Detroit in the 1970s and 80s was a city in transition, and for many, it was a city in pain. Once the proud capital of the American auto industry, the Motor City was now showing cracks. Factories were closing, jobs were disappearing, and whole neighborhoods seemed to fall silent. Houses that once rang with the sound of working-class pride were now marked with boarded windows. The streets told the story of a place where opportunity was drying up, leaving behind frustration, poverty, and an uneasy sense that the best days had passed. For children growing up here, survival often meant learning to adapt quickly, and Demetrius Edward Flenory was one of those children. Born on June 21, 1968, Demetrius grew up in a modest household alongside his younger brother, Terry Lee Flenory. Their parents worked hard, doing everything they could to provide, but the world outside their door was changing faster than they could keep up with. The Flenory home was filled with the sounds of Motown, the warmth of family dinners, and the steady rhythm of Detroit life, but the pull of the streets was never far away. When money was tight, and it often was, Demetrius felt the weight of wanting more, not just for himself but for everyone he loved. Detroit's neighborhoods at that time were rough but alive, a mix of corner stores, barbershops, and hangouts where kids would gather to watch the older hustlers roll by. The older guys had flashy cars, clean clothes, and cash to spend, and for a young Demetrius, they were walking proof that there was a way out of struggle, even if that way was risky. There was something magnetic about the lifestyle, the idea that you could control your own destiny, that you could make more in a day than most people made in a week. Demetrius wasn't the kind of kid who faded into the background. Even as a teenager, he carried himself with a calm, commanding presence that made people pay attention. He had a natural charisma, the kind that made people want to be around him. He was smart, too, sharp enough to notice that hustling wasn't just about muscle, it was about strategy, discipline, and keeping your cool when things got dangerous. By the time he was in high school, Demetrius, now known to his friends as Meech, was already thinking about how to get ahead. He wasn't just looking for quick money, he was looking for a way to build something that could last. His younger brother Terry, nicknamed Southwest T, shared that same drive. Together, they became inseparable partners, two brothers with a shared vision. If they were going to do this, they were going to do it smart. The early days were small and quiet. Selling 50 bags of cocaine out of the back of a car, meeting customers in back alleys and quiet corners. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. Meech approached it like a businessman from the very beginning, reliable product, reliable service, and a level of respect for customers that other street dealers didn't bother with. This approach made people come back. It also made people notice. Detroit was full of hustlers, but few had the patience and foresight that Meech displayed. He didn't get caught up in reckless behavior. He wasn't the kind to flash his money too early, and he wasn't quick to start fights or create enemies. He believed in keeping business clean, no unnecessary drama, no loud moves that brought police attention. Even then, there was a sense that Meech wasn't interested in being just another guy on the block. He was planning something bigger. The city around him continued to decline, with more and more young men being pulled into the streets. Violence was becoming a constant reality, with gangs fighting over territory and the drug trade creating a dangerous new economy. Meech and Terry had to move carefully. Every deal they made was a risk, every day was a chance to get robbed, arrested, or worse. But somehow, they managed to keep building. They learned to trust their instincts, to spot trouble before it arrived, and to stay a step ahead of rivals who might see them as competition. Despite the danger, there was also a strange sense of purpose in what they were doing. They were providing for their family, putting money in their pockets, and gaining respect. For Meech, this respect meant everything. It was proof that he was someone who mattered, someone who could rise above his circumstances. He began to dream of expansion, of taking what they had and growing it into something much larger. But Detroit was only the beginning. Even as teenagers, Meech and Terry could see that staying in one place too long meant trouble. The police were starting to notice their activity, and rivals were watching closely. If they wanted to survive, and thrive, they would need to move beyond their hometown. It was around this time that Meech began to develop the calm, strategic personality that would one day define him as a leader. He learned to be patient, to think before he acted, and to always look at the bigger picture. He was never just reacting, he was planning 2, 3 moves ahead. These traits would serve him well in the years to come, as the small-time operation that started in Detroit grew into a nationwide empire known as the Black Mafia Family. Looking back on those early years, it's easy to see how much they shaped him. Detroit taught Meech about loyalty, who to trust and who to keep at a distance. It taught him about survival, how to read a room, how to move silently when necessary, and how to stay calm when everything around him was chaotic. Most importantly, it gave him the hunger to succeed, the drive to create something bigger than himself. In those quiet Detroit nights, with the sound of distant sirens and the glow of streetlights casting long shadows, a young Meech was laying the foundation for the empire to come. No one could have predicted just how far he and Terry would go, how big their dream would become, or how their story would one day be told on television screens across America. But in that moment, all Meech knew was that he was meant for something more, and he was willing to take the risks to find out what that was. The transition from a small-time hustler to someone with real weight on the streets didn't happen overnight. It came in slow, deliberate steps, like watching a storm gather on the horizon. For Meech and Terry, those first steps into deeper waters were as thrilling as they were dangerous. They had tasted what it meant to make money outside the 9-to-5 grind, but now the question was whether they could turn that taste into something sustainable, something that would set them apart from the dozens of other hustlers who were competing for scraps in Detroit. Their first real crimes beyond corner dealing were carefully chosen. Meech had no interest in chaos or recklessness. He wasn't the kind of man who got a thrill out of unnecessary violence. Instead, he saw the street game as a business, and every risk he took had to be calculated. If they boosted cars, they made sure the cars were sold quickly, cleanly, without drawing heat. If they moved weight, they were careful about who they trusted and where they kept their product. This discipline earned them a reputation early on. These weren't just kids playing gangster, these were young men who treated hustling like an art form. Detroit in the late 80s was dangerous, and to survive, you had to be just as smart as you were tough. Meech began to build a crew, not just anyone, but people he believed could be trusted to keep quiet, to handle business without drawing too much attention. It was a tight circle, and even in these early days, Meech showed the leadership qualities that would make him a legend later on. He was calm under pressure, always thinking about tomorrow, always reminding his people that this was about getting ahead, not about proving who was the toughest. One of the first real challenges came when rivals noticed how quickly Meech and Terry were moving product. Competition was fierce, and in Detroit, disputes over territory could turn bloody. But Meech handled it differently. Rather than meeting threats with immediate violence, he found ways to negotiate, to keep the peace when possible. This wasn't out of fear, it was strategy. Every gunfight, every beef was a risk that could bring police attention, and Meech wanted to stay as far under the radar as possible. He understood that the real power wasn't in flexing on the block, but in staying invisible long enough to build something unstoppable. Still, trouble was never far away. There were times when they had to defend themselves, moments when rivals tested their resolve. These encounters became part of the legend of the Flenory brothers, 2 young men who could hold their ground when they had to but never let pride drag them into unnecessary war. Meech had a natural charisma that made people listen, even enemies. He could diffuse a tense situation with a few calm words, and when he couldn't, he made sure that the response was swift, clean, and left no trail back to him. It was during this period that Meech started thinking bigger. Selling small amounts on the corner wasn't going to be enough. He wanted to move serious weight, kilos, not ounces. To do that, they had to find reliable suppliers, people who could provide them with high-quality product in bulk. This was no small task. Getting connected to the right sources meant stepping into a higher level of the game, where the stakes were bigger and the consequences harsher. But Meech and Terry were patient, slowly building their network until they had what they needed. As they gained access to larger quantities, their operation grew more organized. They began to structure their business like a company, with clear roles and responsibilities. Terry was excellent with logistics, making sure everything moved efficiently, while Meech focused on relationships and strategy. Together, they were a perfect balance, one handling the day-to-day details, the other dreaming about the future. Word started to spread. The Flenory brothers weren't just another crew, they were running things with a level of professionalism that impressed even their competitors. This respect opened doors, allowing them to expand their reach beyond their immediate neighborhood. Soon, their product was moving across different parts of the city, then into neighboring towns. What began as a hustle on the block was turning into a real enterprise. But with growth came new risks. Law enforcement was starting to notice the increase in activity. Detectives were asking questions, making rounds, trying to figure out who was behind the steady flow of drugs hitting the streets. Meech knew that it was only a matter of time before the police turned up the heat, and so he doubled down on secrecy. He kept his inner circle small, used lookouts and codes, and reminded everyone that staying quiet was the key to staying free. Even as the risks mounted, Meech's vision grew. He began to dream of expanding beyond Detroit entirely. Why stop at one city when there were entire states that could be supplied? Why play small when there was a chance to play big? These thoughts kept him moving forward, always looking for the next opportunity, always planning the next step. There were moments of celebration too, nights when the brothers would sit back and look at how far they had come, counting stacks of cash, laughing about the early days when they were just two kids hustling to make ends meet. Those moments strengthened their bond, reinforcing the idea that they were unstoppable as long as they stuck together. But even then, there were hints of what was to come. Meech's natural charm meant he liked to enjoy the fruits of his labor, going out, dressing sharp, being seen. Terry, on the other hand, preferred to stay low-key, cautious about attracting attention. These differences didn't cause serious problems yet, but they were early signs of a divide that would one day grow wider. For now, though, everything seemed to be moving in the right direction. The money was good, the network was growing, and the brothers were building something that was no longer just a hustle, it was a business, and one that was only going to get bigger. The streets were talking, and the name Meech was beginning to carry weight far beyond his block. And yet, there was a quiet question in the air, one that Meech may have felt even in those early days: how long can this last? How long can anyone play this game before the risks catch up? The answer, of course, would come years later, but for now, Meech was focused on the climb. The future stretched before him like an open road, and he was ready to drive it as far as it would go. Growth, when it came, felt both natural and unstoppable. Meech and Terry had spent years laying the groundwork, learning the rules of the game, building trust with suppliers, and proving they could handle serious weight without losing control. Now, their operation was ready to move beyond the corners and back alleys of Detroit. The brothers saw the bigger picture clearly: the real money, the real power, wasn't in running a neighborhood. It was in running a network. Scaling up meant changing the way they thought about everything. The business could no longer be casual or sloppy. It had to run like a machine. Terry, with his meticulous nature, focused on logistics, figuring out how to transport products safely from one city to another, how to set up stash houses, and how to create routes that avoided police detection. Meech, meanwhile, focused on relationships, recruiting new people who could be trusted to handle business in other cities. It wasn't just about finding good hustlers, it was about finding loyal, disciplined partners who understood the vision. Detroit remained the home base, but soon their influence began to spread into neighboring cities: Flint, Cleveland, St. Louis. At first, the moves were small, testing the waters, making sure they could handle the increased volume without attracting too much attention. But as those first expansions proved successful, they pushed further, step by step. Each new city brought fresh challenges, new rivals, new law enforcement to evade, and new crews to manage. What made Meech different was his approach to leadership. Most drug crews relied on fear to keep people in line, intimidation, threats, violence. Meech took a different path. He inspired loyalty by taking care of his people. When someone worked for him, they got paid on time, they were looked after, and they felt like they were part of something bigger. This created a bond that went beyond money. People wanted to work for Meech because they respected him. As the operation expanded, Meech began to dream of something even bigger, a true organization, structured like a corporation, where every person had a role to play. He and Terry divided responsibilities, creating a system where product flowed from suppliers to distributors with military precision. Runners delivered packages, stash house managers kept inventory, and money counters worked day and night to keep track of the endless flow of cash. The scale of the business was growing rapidly. What started with 50 bags on the block was now hundreds of kilos moving across state lines. The profits were staggering, and with them came new possibilities. Meech began to upgrade his lifestyle, though still cautiously compared to the flash he would show later. Better cars, better clothes, nicer homes, but always careful not to flaunt too much in Detroit, where police already had their eyes on the drug trade. Terry's role became even more critical as the network stretched wider. He was the one who made sure shipments moved smoothly, that there were backup plans for every possible problem. If a car got pulled over, if a driver went missing, if a stash house was compromised, Terry was the one who knew what to do next. His cautious, detail-oriented nature kept the whole operation from collapsing under its own weight. Of course, expansion didn't go unnoticed. Rivals saw what the brothers were doing and either wanted a piece or wanted to stop them. Law enforcement began connecting dots, realizing that the increase in drug traffic across multiple cities wasn't random. But Meech and Terry stayed disciplined, making sure that everything was compartmentalized. No one person knew the entire picture except them. Meech's growing reputation also helped them avoid unnecessary wars. People knew that he wasn't someone to cross lightly, not because he was the most violent, but because he was respected. His ability to negotiate, to form alliances instead of enemies, allowed the brothers to keep their expansion relatively smooth compared to the chaos that usually followed drug empires. Each success only fueled Meech's ambition. He could see the future clearly now. He didn't just want to run Detroit or even the Midwest. He wanted to create something that stretched across the country, an organization so powerful it could rival the cartels in Mexico. He began to talk about building a network that would one day be legendary, a name that everyone in the streets would know. The operation's scale meant that money was pouring in faster than they could spend it. Cash stacked up in duffel bags and hidden compartments, forcing them to come up with new ways to launder it and make it look legitimate. This was where Meech's creative thinking came into play. He started considering ways to blend the street business with legitimate ventures, something that would allow them to live large without attracting as much suspicion. Even in this period of growth, there were moments of tension. The pressure of expansion was intense, and Meech and Terry sometimes disagreed on how fast to move, how much to risk. Terry's cautious side often clashed with Meech's boldness. But for now, the disagreements were manageable, and the vision they shared kept them united. In these years, the brothers were still largely in the shadows. They weren't yet the household names they would become. They were ghosts moving through the underworld, building something massive just out of sight of the public. But those who knew them could feel what was coming. The Flenory brothers weren't just hustlers anymore. They were becoming bosses. And with every new city they added to their network, with every new recruit they brought into the fold, they were getting closer to the moment when the name Black Mafia Family would be born, a name that would turn their growing empire into a brand, a movement, and eventually, a legend. The question was no longer whether Meech and Terry could rise, it was how high they were willing to climb. And as the 1990s wore on, it became clear that the climb had only just begun. The foundation was set. The machine was running. The next step would be to turn this invisible empire into something the whole world could see, and that step would change everything. By the late 1990s, the Flenory brothers had grown far beyond the neighborhood hustlers they once were. Their operation now stretched across several states, their network ran like clockwork, and the profits were flowing faster than they could count. But for Meech, this wasn't enough. He had always been a man who thought big, and now, he was ready to give their empire an identity, a name that would turn it into something more than a network of dealers. He wanted to create a family, a movement, a symbol that would stand for everything they had built. And so, the Black Mafia Family was born. The name carried weight the moment it was spoken. It was bold, almost cinematic, and it signaled that this was no longer just a crew, it was an organization. Meech understood the power of branding before most people in his world did. He knew that a name could create loyalty, inspire fear, and spark curiosity all at once. With BMF, he wasn't just running a drug empire. He was creating a lifestyle. The BMF name began appearing everywhere within their circle, on t-shirts, hats, and jewelry. It was more than just letters, it was a badge of belonging. To be part of BMF was to be part of something elite, something that promised money, respect, and a sense of purpose. Meech made sure that the people under him felt valued. He threw legendary parties where everyone could feel like they were part of the success. He looked out for his crew, bailing people out when they got locked up, helping with rent, making sure everyone ate. This loyalty went both ways. In return, his people would do anything for him. Atlanta became the perfect stage for BMF's rise. By the early 2000s, the city was booming with hip-hop culture, a place where the music industry and the street world often collided. Meech saw an opportunity to merge the two. He understood that being seen with rappers, producers, and DJs would not only elevate his status but also give BMF a level of legitimacy. He began building connections in the music world, supporting up-and-coming artists, and making sure BMF was a name that everyone in the clubs recognized. Meech himself became something of a celebrity. He wasn't rapping, but he was living the kind of life rappers talked about in their songs: exotic cars, private parties, designer clothes, stacks of money so high they barely seemed real. And yet, despite the flash, he carried himself with the same calm confidence that had defined him from the start. People respected him not just because of his money, but because of the way he treated others. One of the most brilliant moves Meech made was blurring the line between street money and entertainment money. He began to invest in BMF Entertainment, a music promotion and management company that gave them a legitimate front. The company worked with rising stars, helped promote concerts, and placed BMF right at the center of hip-hop's growing empire. This move was genius. Not only did it give Meech and his crew a reason to be around celebrities and clubs without raising suspicion, but it also allowed them to launder some of their money in plain sight. The parties became legendary. BMF would show up to clubs with entourages so big that they looked like movie scenes. Meech would spend tens of thousands of dollars in a single night, buying drinks for entire clubs, raining money onto dance floors. The effect was electric. People talked about it for weeks afterward. It wasn't just spending for the sake of spending, it was advertising. Every party, every appearance, every flashy car was a reminder that BMF was bigger than just business. It was culture. But with visibility came risk. Meech knew this. The more public they became, the more attention they would draw, not just from fans and rappers, but from law enforcement. And yet, Meech believed that controlling the narrative was more powerful than hiding in the shadows. If people were going to talk about BMF, he wanted to control what they were saying. The brothers, however, were not entirely on the same page. Terry, Southwest T, preferred to stay in the background, running the operation quietly and efficiently. He worried that all the attention could lead to their downfall. Meech, on the other hand, believed that the image they projected was part of the power they held. This quiet difference in philosophy would eventually grow into a rift, but at this stage, the results spoke for themselves. The network was stronger than ever, the money was flowing, and BMF had become a household name in the streets. What set BMF apart from so many other organizations was its structure. This was not a chaotic street gang. This was an empire with hierarchy, discipline, and a vision for the future. Meech didn't just want to make money, he wanted to change the game. He wanted BMF to be remembered, to become a legend that would live on long after he was gone. And for a while, it seemed like that dream was becoming a reality. There was an almost mythic quality to BMF during this time. Stories circulated about their cars, their homes, their spending habits, stories that sometimes grew bigger with each telling. People claimed to have seen Meech give away thousands of dollars to strangers, to have seen him arrive at clubs with caravans of SUVs, to have seen parties so extravagant they felt unreal. Whether every story was true didn't matter. The legend was what Meech wanted. The bigger the story, the bigger the brand. In many ways, this was the peak of the dream. BMF had become more than a criminal enterprise. It was a movement, a symbol of what could happen when ambition met discipline and vision. For Meech, this was the realization of everything he had imagined back on those Detroit nights when he and Terry were first selling on the corner. He had turned hustle into history, struggle into style. But even at the peak, the seeds of trouble were beginning to take root. Law enforcement was watching more closely than ever, building cases, running wiretaps, and following the money trail. The visibility that made BMF legendary was also making them vulnerable. And as Meech stood in the center of it all, calm, confident, and smiling, the question became not whether BMF could keep growing, but how long they could outrun the storm that was gathering. By the time the name Black Mafia Family was firmly on the map, Meech had become more than just a kingpin, he was a symbol. His name alone carried weight, a mixture of respect, admiration, and fear. What made him so unique was that he wasn't the loud, brash gangster stereotype people expected. Meech was calm, soft-spoken even, with a charisma that drew people in. He didn't need to threaten anyone or raise his voice, his presence was enough to set the tone in any room. People said he had a way of looking right through you, measuring you, deciding whether you belonged in his world. And if he decided you did, loyalty was rewarded in ways that few leaders could match. Meech's leadership style was one of the keys to BMF's success. Where others ruled through fear, Meech led through inspiration. He treated BMF like a family in the truest sense, making sure his people were taken care of, making sure everyone shared in the wealth. If someone needed help with legal trouble, he covered it. If someone's family was struggling, he stepped in. That kind of loyalty created an organization that was tighter and more disciplined than almost anything law enforcement had seen. People weren't just working for Meech for money, they were working for him because they believed in him. This sense of family extended even to the image Meech projected to the world. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't some shadowy figure who kept to dark corners. He walked through clubs like he owned them, dapped up rappers, shook hands with promoters, smiled for cameras. He wanted BMF to feel like it was bigger than the underworld, like it was part of the culture. In many ways, Meech blurred the line between criminal boss and hip-hop mogul. He lived the kind of life rappers dreamed about, only for Meech, it wasn't a fantasy. It was his reality. At the height of his power, Meech's life was a non-stop carousel of high-end living. Exotic cars lined up in driveways like trophies, Ferraris, Lamborghinis, Bentleys, all spotless and shining. He had multiple homes, mansions with marble floors and sprawling living rooms, pools where parties seemed to never end. His closets were filled with the latest designer clothes, jewelry that glittered like starlight, and shoes that looked like they had never touched the pavement. And yet, despite all the flash, Meech carried himself with a calm, deliberate dignity. He didn't flaunt to prove a point, he flaunted because, to him, this was the natural result of hard work. One of the most legendary aspects of Meech's persona was the way he spent money. He had a reputation for generosity that bordered on myth. There were stories of him walking into a club and buying bottles for every single table, of him throwing stacks of cash into the air just to watch it rain down on the crowd, of him handing money to strangers on the street simply because he could. These weren't just acts of indulgence, they were statements. They reminded everyone that Meech wasn't just rich, he was untouchable. But even in this life of excess, there was discipline. Meech had rules. He expected professionalism from everyone around him. No one was to draw unnecessary attention to themselves, no one was to be sloppy, no one was to bring problems back to the family. Those who disrespected the code were quickly cut off, not with loud confrontations, but with quiet finality. It was this balance between generosity and order that allowed BMF to function like a well-oiled machine even as it grew into one of the largest drug operations in American history. Meech also had an uncanny ability to spot talent, not just in the drug trade, but in the music world. He supported artists, helped them get studio time, promoted their shows. To many in Atlanta's hip-hop scene, Meech wasn't just a gangster, he was a patron, someone who believed in the culture and wanted to see it thrive. This gave BMF an image that went far beyond fear. They were cool. They were aspirational. They were living proof of the street dream. Despite the image, Meech knew he was being watched. Federal agencies had started to put together pieces of the puzzle, trying to figure out just how deep BMF's network ran. Wiretaps, surveillance, informants, Meech was aware of it all. And yet, he carried himself with the same calm as always. If he was worried, he didn't show it. This composure made him even more legendary in the eyes of those around him. What Meech understood better than most was that power wasn't just about money or muscle. It was about narrative. It was about controlling the way people saw you. If the world saw you as a boss, if they believed in your legend, then your power became self-sustaining. People respected BMF not just because of what they did, but because of what they represented: loyalty, ambition, and success against all odds. As the early 2000s rolled on, Meech was everywhere, in photos with rappers, at industry events, in VIP sections across the country. He was living like a celebrity without ever stepping into a recording booth. And for a time, it seemed like nothing could touch him. The money kept coming, the parties kept going, and BMF kept growing. But somewhere under the surface, pressure was building. The bigger the operation got, the harder it became to keep everything quiet. More money meant more people involved, and more people meant more chances for someone to make a mistake. The balance Meech had maintained for so long, between the underworld and the limelight, between order and chaos, was starting to wobble. Still, Meech remained calm. He believed in the vision. He believed in the discipline of his crew. And he believed that as long as they kept moving forward, they could stay ahead of whatever was coming. What he didn't know was that the storm gathering around them was unlike anything they had faced before, and that soon, even the calmest man in the room would have to confront the possibility that the dream might not last forever. For all of Meech's charisma and vision, BMF was never a one-man show. Terry, Southwest T. Flenory was the other half of the empire, the quieter half, the shadow moving alongside the spotlight. If Meech was the face, Terry was the spine, the one who kept the entire operation standing tall behind the scenes. Together, they had built something extraordinary, a network so organized it was admired even by the law enforcement agencies tasked with taking it down. But as BMF reached new heights, cracks began to form, not from the outside, but from within. Terry had always been different from Meech. Where Meech thrived on being seen, on projecting an image, Terry preferred to stay out of the frame. He was careful, cautious, and pragmatic, a man who believed that the less people knew, the safer you were. To him, the idea of cameras flashing and BMF's name being chanted in nightclubs wasn't power, it was risk. Terry wasn't jealous of Meech's spotlight, but he worried that it was shining too brightly, drawing the kind of attention that could bring everything crashing down. Their personalities had always complemented each other. Meech's gift was connection, his ability to inspire loyalty, to recruit and motivate, to make people feel like they were part of something historic. Terry's gift was control, keeping the machinery running smoothly, making sure product moved efficiently, ensuring that every dollar was accounted for. But the very qualities that made them strong as a team were beginning to pull them apart as the empire grew larger and more visible. Meech believed that the image they projected was as important as the business itself. The flash, the parties, the public presence, these things didn't just feed his ego, they were part of his strategy. In his mind, they made BMF untouchable. If everyone saw them as larger than life, no one would dare challenge them. Terry saw it differently. To him, every photo taken, every article written, every rumor whispered was another piece of evidence that could one day be used against them. Their arguments were quiet at first, private conversations behind closed doors. Terry would urge caution, telling Meech to pull back, to keep a lower profile. Meech would counter that the spotlight was part of the plan, that the brand needed to be seen to grow. These were not shouting matches, neither brother was prone to yelling, but they carried a weight that everyone around them could feel. As time went on, the tension became harder to ignore. Terry wanted to shift the focus entirely to business, to reduce risk and prepare for a day when they could transition into legitimate ventures. Meech wanted to keep building the legend, to make BMF so big that it would never be forgotten. Both visions were powerful, but they were beginning to move in different directions. The people closest to them started to notice the divide. Crew members would quietly wonder which brother they should listen to when instructions conflicted. Some sided with Terry, believing his cautious approach was the only thing keeping them from self-destruction. Others were drawn to Meech's charisma, believing that his boldness was what had brought them this far in the first place. Despite the tension, the brothers never stopped loving or respecting each other. Their bond was deep, forged through years of shared struggle. But even deep bonds can strain under pressure, and the pressure on BMF was mounting. The network was bigger than ever, and so were the risks. One mistake, one betrayal, could bring the entire empire crashing down. Meech tried to bridge the gap, reminding Terry that they were in this together, that the dream had always been theirs. And for a time, they managed to keep things from boiling over. But the differences between them were real, and they weren't going away. Terry's worry was growing heavier by the day, and Meech's commitment to the spotlight was growing just as strong. There's a quiet tragedy in this part of the story, two brothers who built everything side by side, now starting to drift apart, not out of anger or betrayal, but out of different visions for the future. Each one believed he was protecting what they had built. Each one believed he was right. In the calm of those late-night strategy meetings, with the sound of money counters whirring in the background and stacks of cash piled high on the table, you can almost imagine the two of them sitting across from each other. Terry, leaning forward, speaking in his measured, careful tone. Meech, leaning back, calm but resolute, explaining why the image was everything. Two men who loved each other but who were starting to see the world through different lenses. This growing divide would not destroy BMF overnight, but it planted the seeds for decisions that would echo through the years to come. When law enforcement finally closed in, when the empire began to crack under the weight of investigations and indictments, those differences would become harder to reconcile. For now, the machine kept running, the money kept flowing, and BMF kept growing. But somewhere beneath the surface, something had shifted. The empire that had always felt unbreakable was beginning to feel fragile, not because of any outside threat, but because of the quiet space opening up between the two brothers who had built it all. And as the story moved forward, that space would only grow wider. If Detroit had been the proving ground and the Midwest their training field, Atlanta was where the Flenory brothers turned their empire into a cultural movement. By the early 2000s, Atlanta was quickly becoming the capital of hip-hop in America. It was a city buzzing with energy, clubs packed every night, radio stations breaking new artists, and producers churning out beats that would shape an entire generation of music. For Meech, this was the perfect backdrop. If BMF was going to be more than just a name whispered on the streets, if it was going to become a symbol, Atlanta was where that transformation would happen. Meech had always understood the power of image, and the music industry gave him the biggest stage of all. He began forming relationships with rappers, producers, DJs, and promoters, not as a hanger-on but as a patron, someone who could open doors, provide funding, and make big moves happen. His reputation preceded him. Everyone in Atlanta's scene knew about the man who spent more in one night than most rappers made in a month, the man who rolled deep with fleets of cars and crews dressed head to toe in designer clothes. BMF Entertainment was Meech's masterstroke. Officially, it was a music promotion and management company, but unofficially, it was the perfect cover for BMF's ever-growing financial footprint. Through BMF Entertainment, Meech could justify his presence at concerts, parties, and industry events. It gave him a reason to be seen spending big money, sponsoring shows, and rubbing shoulders with major names. More importantly, it gave BMF a brand identity that stretched far beyond the drug game. At this point, Meech wasn't just a boss, he was a cultural figure. He lived the life rappers rapped about: champagne, mansions, jewelry, beautiful women, and he did it all with a calm confidence that made him seem untouchable. Clubs would buzz with excitement when word spread that Meech was coming through. His arrival was an event, his presence a performance. He often traveled with massive entourages, sometimes so large they had to be split across multiple SUVs. The sight of dozens of men pulling up in black trucks, moving as one, became a trademark of BMF's presence. Inside the clubs, Meech was known for his generosity and flamboyance. He might spend $50,000 or $100,000 in a single night, buying bottles for everyone, making the dance floor rain money until it looked like a movie scene. He didn't do this quietly, it was part of the spectacle, part of the legend. Photographers captured the moments, rappers mentioned him in songs, and soon, Meech was a name known far outside the streets. This era also saw Meech forging ties with rising artists who would go on to become major stars. One of the most famous of these was young Jeezy. At the time, Jeezy was an up-and-coming rapper with a street-oriented sound that resonated with BMF's image. Meech supported him, promoted his music, and helped build his profile. To many, Jeezy became the unofficial voice of BMF, his lyrics painting vivid pictures of the lifestyle Meech embodied. Meech wasn't trying to become a rapper himself, but he understood that music was one of the most powerful tools for storytelling. Every time a rapper shouted out BMF in a song, every time a music video showed BMF chains gleaming under the lights, it was free promotion for the brand. It made BMF feel larger than life, almost mythological, and it made Meech's legend grow even faster. But with all this attention came risk. Law enforcement, already suspicious of the size of BMF's operation, began paying closer attention to its connection with the music industry. The very thing that made BMF seem untouchable, its visibility, was also leaving a trail of evidence. Photos, videos, public appearances, all of these became puzzle pieces that investigators could use to build their case. Terry's concerns during this time grew louder. He saw the music industry connections as a double-edged sword. Yes, they made BMF look legitimate, but they also made it impossible to stay low-key. Meech, however, believed that pulling back now would be a mistake. The momentum they had built was incredible, and he wanted to ride it as far as it would go. For the men inside BMF, this was a golden era. The money was flowing, the parties were endless, and the name BMF was synonymous with power and luxury. Members wore their affiliation like a badge of honor. Being seen with Meech was a status symbol, proof that you were connected to something bigger. And yet, beneath all the glamour, there was a subtle shift happening. The lines between business and entertainment were blurring. Some members got caught up in the lifestyle, forgetting the discipline that had kept them safe for so long. Flashy cars, extravagant spending, and public displays of wealth were no longer just for Meech, everyone wanted to live like the boss. This worried Terry deeply. The more visible they became, the harder it would be to protect the operation. Despite the growing tension, Meech pressed forward. BMF was now a name on everyone's lips, in the streets, in the clubs, and on the radio. To pull back would mean losing momentum, losing influence, losing the very thing that had made them untouchable. And so, the parties got bigger, the spending got flashier, and the legend grew louder. The story of BMF's connection to hip-hop is one of the most fascinating chapters in American street history because it represents a rare moment where two worlds collided perfectly, the underworld and the entertainment world feeding off each other, elevating each other. Meech became a symbol not just of crime but of aspiration. To many young people, he was living proof that the street dream could come true, that you could rise from nothing and build a kingdom with your own hands. But as the cameras kept flashing and the name kept spreading, a question loomed quietly in the background: how much longer could this last? Meech might have been living like a rap star, but unlike the rappers, he wasn't telling fictional stories. His empire was real, and so were the federal agents who were beginning to close in. At its peak, the Black Mafia Family was more than just a drug organization, it was an empire that seemed to stretch from coast to coast. The scale was staggering. Federal agents would later estimate that BMF was moving hundreds of kilos of cocaine every month, generating hundreds of millions of dollars over the years. To outsiders, it looked like a well-oiled machine that couldn't be stopped. In city after city, Atlanta, Los Angeles, St. Louis, Detroit, Miami, the BMF name carried weight. It wasn't just a crew anymore, it was a network with soldiers, lieutenants, stash house managers, drivers, and accountants all playing their part. Meech stood at the center of it all, calm as ever, like a general surveying his battlefield. The parties were still loud, the spending still outrageous, but behind the scenes, he was running a highly disciplined organization. Shipments arrived from Mexico through trusted cartel connections. Couriers transported product across the country in hidden compartments, returning with bags of cash that were counted, stacked, and hidden in safe houses. The money was so abundant that they ran out of places to put it. Vacuum-sealed bricks of cash sat in basements, closets, and storage units, waiting to be cleaned and reintroduced into circulation. For those inside BMF, it felt like they were untouchable. The crew was tight, the system worked, and the name inspired respect and fear. In many cities, rivals backed down rather than risk war. Meech had turned BMF into something that felt unstoppable, and yet, in the quiet moments, there was a growing sense that the good times couldn't last forever. Paranoia began creeping in, slow but steady, like a shadow stretching across the floor. Meech was too smart not to notice the signs. Unmarked cars parked too long on corners. Faces that seemed familiar appearing near stash houses. Conversations that felt just a little too strange, as if someone was fishing for information. Rumors began circulating that law enforcement had wiretaps in place, that the DEA, FBI, and local police were working together to bring BMF down. Meech tightened security. Phones were used carefully, conversations were coded, and meetings were conducted in person whenever possible. The inner circle grew even smaller. Everyone was reminded that discretion wasn't optional, it was survival. For the first time, Meech's calm exterior was shadowed by something heavier. He was still smiling, still hosting parties, but behind the scenes he was watching everything more closely, scanning for signs of betrayal. The risk wasn't just from law enforcement. As BMF grew, so did the number of people involved, and with more people came more chances for mistakes. A careless word, a sloppy move, a dispute over money, any of these could bring unwanted attention. Meech had always prided himself on keeping things disciplined, but it was getting harder to control every piece of the puzzle. Terry's worries grew louder during this period. He could see what Meech saw, and it unsettled him. To Terry, the logical move was to start winding things down, to prepare for an exit. They had made more money than they had ever dreamed of, why not get out while they were ahead? Meech, though, wasn't ready to let go. He believed they could still stay ahead of the feds, that their organization was too disciplined to fall apart. To him, pulling back now would mean surrendering everything they had worked for. Still, Meech took the threat seriously. He began to move more carefully, staying mobile, shifting between locations to avoid surveillance. When he traveled, it was with trusted people and in carefully planned convoys. Stash houses were rotated more frequently, and some were even abandoned entirely if they felt compromised. Every move became part of a chess game with law enforcement, a game Meech was determined to win. Despite the tension, BMF at its peak was awe-inspiring. The money was endless, the cars were flawless, and the brand was so powerful that even people outside the street world admired it. Young men wore BMF shirts proudly, rappers shouted them out in songs, and the image of Meech standing in VIP sections with celebrities became iconic. To many, he was living proof that the street dream could be real, that someone could rise from nothing to become not just rich but legendary. But the paranoia was real, too. Wiretaps were indeed in place, quietly recording conversations. Informants were quietly feeding information to law enforcement. Task forces were holding meetings, pinning photos of Meech and Terry on investigation boards, connecting dots on maps that showed the reach of BMF across the country. Every move Meech made was being watched, even if he didn't know exactly how closely. Some nights, Meech would sit in one of his mansions, the music turned low, the party over, stacks of cash piled on the table. The house would be quiet except for the hum of air conditioning and the faint sound of a money counter in another room. In those moments, maybe he felt the weight of what was coming. He had built something incredible, something that had become part of the culture, but he knew that no empire lasts forever. For his people, though, Meech never showed fear. If there was worry in his mind, he kept it hidden. His calm gave everyone else confidence, and as long as Meech seemed unshaken, they kept believing they were untouchable. But the truth was clear, the walls were closing in. Law enforcement was patient, and when they struck, they would do it hard and fast. This was the empire at its highest point, shining, powerful, and admired, but also standing on the edge of a cliff. The next chapter wouldn't be about expansion. It would be about survival. When federal agents decided to go after the Black Mafia family, they didn't come lightly. They knew what they were dealing with, not just a neighborhood gang or a small crew, but a nationwide network that was moving hundreds of kilos and generating millions of dollars. To dismantle BMF, they needed a plan as disciplined and organized as the operation itself. And so, the storm Meech had long sensed finally began to take shape. Multiple agencies came together to form a joint task force dedicated solely to BMF. The DEA, FBI, and local police departments all pooled resources, sharing information, wiretaps, and surveillance data. It was no longer a few investigators asking questions, it was a full-scale operation with dozens of agents working around the clock. In offices miles away from Meech's lavish homes and packed nightclubs, boards were being filled with photos, names, phone records, and maps of stash houses. Red string connected cities like Atlanta, Detroit, St. Louis, and Los Angeles, tracing the flow of product and cash across the country. The first step was to follow the money. Agents began monitoring bank deposits, tracing cash purchases, and flagging suspicious transactions. They discovered luxury cars bought in cash, homes paid for outright, and money orders funneled through shell companies. All of it pointed to an operation far larger than anything they had seen in years. The more they uncovered, the more determined they became to take it all down. Surveillance teams worked in shifts, tailing cars, staking out clubs where Meech was known to appear, and watching stash houses from unmarked vans parked across the street. Wiretaps captured conversations in which coded language hinted at shipments, drop-offs, and collections. Slowly, piece by piece, a picture began to emerge, not just of BMF's scale, but of its hierarchy. Meech, of course, knew something was happening. He had seen enough in his years on the street to recognize when the heat was rising. Phones were switched more frequently now, and conversations grew even more coded. Face-to-face meetings became the norm. When Meech traveled, he took elaborate precautions, often switching vehicles mid-trip, using decoy cars, and avoiding predictable routes. Despite these precautions, there was a sense that the walls were closing in. Associates started getting picked up, low-level members first, then mid-level lieutenants. Some were caught with cash, others with product, and the pressure to cooperate with law enforcement was relentless. Meech had always prided himself on inspiring loyalty, but he knew that no one could guarantee silence forever. The more people were arrested, the greater the risk that someone would talk. Inside BMF, paranoia began to spread. Members whispered about snitches, wondering who might have flipped, who might be wearing a wire. Some distanced themselves, quietly slipping away from the organization to avoid being caught in the crossfire. Others stayed loyal but became more tense, more anxious. Even Terry, who had been urging caution for years, began to see that they were reaching a breaking point. The task force began making bigger moves. Raids on stash houses turned up staggering amounts of cash, sometimes millions at a time, bundled and vacuum-sealed. Cars with hidden compartments were seized, revealing kilos of cocaine. Each bust was another piece of the puzzle, another confirmation that they were on the right track. For Meech, it became a daily balancing act. On one hand, he needed to maintain the image of confidence that had always kept his crew calm. On the other, he had to make hard decisions about the future, moving stash houses, relocating people, even considering whether to temporarily scale back operations. The one thing he refused to do was panic. To those around him, he still seemed unshaken, still the calm center of the storm. And yet, late at night, when the house was quiet and the phones were off, Meech surely felt the pressure pressing down. He had built BMF into something legendary, something that felt invincible, but now he was facing an opponent that couldn't be intimidated or negotiated with. This wasn't a rival crew. This was the federal government, patient and relentless, willing to spend years putting together a case airtight enough to bring him down. Wiretaps captured some of the most damaging evidence during this period. Even coded conversations, when pieced together, revealed the scope of BMF's operation. Agents worked tirelessly, transcribing hours of calls, connecting voices to names, building a case that would one day be presented in court. Meech, who had always been careful about what he said, must have known that every word could be used against him, but there was only so much he could do to stay completely off the radar. The growing pressure began to affect the relationship between the brothers as well. Terry, more cautious than ever, argued that it was time to step back, to prepare an exit strategy before it was too late. Meech, still believing in his ability to outmaneuver the feds, was reluctant to walk away. This difference in philosophy created more strain, quietly dividing loyalties within the organization. Meanwhile, law enforcement tightened the net further. They had informants inside, surveillance on the outside, and evidence piling up by the day. The task force was patient, waiting until they had enough to not just arrest Meech and Terry, but to dismantle the entire operation in one coordinated sweep. For BMF, this was the beginning of the end, though many of its members didn't realize it yet. To them, life still looked good. The parties still went on, the money still came in, and Meech still walked through clubs like a king. But the ground beneath them was shifting, slowly but surely, and when it gave way, it would do so all at once. This was the calm before the storm, the tense silence before the first crack of thunder. Everyone could feel that something was coming. The only question was when it would hit, and how hard. As the task force tightened its grip and the investigation gained momentum, the strain inside BMF began to show, not just among the rank and file, but at the very top. For years, Meech and Terry had been a perfect team, two halves of a whole. Meech was the visionary, the face, the dreamer who turned the hustle into a movement. Terry was the architect, the quiet strategist who kept everything organized and efficient. Together, they had been unstoppable. But now, with law enforcement circling closer and paranoia rising, the brothers found themselves drifting in opposite directions. Terry had been warning Meech for months that the operation was getting too big, too loud. Every party, every public appearance, every photograph taken in a club was, in Terry's mind, another piece of evidence waiting to be used against them. He wanted to pull back, scale down, even consider stepping away entirely. They had made millions, more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of their lives. Why keep tempting fate when they were already under a microscope? Meech, though, saw things differently. To him, pulling back now would not only signal weakness but also risk losing everything they had built. The brand, the name, the power they had cultivated, it would all fade if they disappeared from the spotlight. BMF wasn't just a business anymore, it was a cultural force, and Meech felt a responsibility to keep it alive. He believed that as long as they stayed disciplined, as long as they kept their people in line, they could survive the heat and keep the machine running. Their disagreements started small, quiet conversations behind closed doors. Terry would argue for caution, Meech would argue for confidence. But over time, the tension became harder to contain. Associates noticed the subtle shift in tone. There were fewer moments of shared laughter between the brothers, more moments of silence, of long pauses in meetings where once there had been easy agreement. Some within BMF began to take sides, whether intentionally or not. Those who preferred the quieter, low-key approach gravitated toward Terry, who continued to run the day-to-day logistics with precision. Those who were drawn to the glamour and the legend stayed close to Meech, whose charisma made them feel like they were part of history in the making. This quiet division didn't shatter the organization, but it created a tension that pulsed beneath the surface like an invisible current. The stress of constant surveillance added to the strain. Terry became convinced that their phones were compromised and began refusing to talk about business over any line, insisting on face-to-face meetings only. He encouraged others to do the same, even if it slowed down communication. Meech, while also cautious, couldn't run BMF entirely from the shadows. Too much of the operation depended on his presence, his connections, his ability to motivate and manage. There were also personal pressures weighing on Terry. Unlike Meech, who seemed to thrive in the chaos, Terry wanted stability. He wanted to ensure his family's safety, to create a future where he wouldn't always be looking over his shoulder. The risk of losing it all, not just money, but freedom, gnawed at him. Every new raid, every new arrest, every rumor about an informant was another reminder that their empire was built on borrowed time. Meech tried to reassure his brother, telling him that they had been through tough times before and always found a way through. He reminded Terry of everything they had accomplished, of how far they had come since those early days in Detroit. He believed that they were too smart, too disciplined, to fall victim to the same mistakes that had brought down other organizations. To Meech, fear was the real enemy, the thing that could make them panic and slip up. But for Terry, this wasn't about fear. It was about realism. The writing was on the wall, and he wanted to prepare for the inevitable before it was too late. This fundamental difference in outlook became the quiet wedge driving them apart. They were still brothers, still partners, but the unity that had once been their greatest strength was beginning to fray. In the stillness of late-night meetings, with money counters humming in the background and phones sitting silent on the table, you can imagine the conversations. Terry's voice, calm but firm, urging a strategic retreat. Meech's voice, steady and confident, insisting that they press forward. Two visions of the future colliding, one rooted in caution, the other in ambition. This was the beginning of an emotional crossroads for BMF. The empire still stood, the money still flowed, but the brothers were no longer perfectly aligned. And in an organization as large and powerful as BMF, even a small crack at the top could ripple through the entire structure. Those who were closest to the brothers would later say that despite their differences, Meech and Terry never stopped respecting each other. The bond they shared was deep, forged in hardship, and even disagreement couldn't erase the love between them. But respect couldn't erase reality, and reality was closing in fast. Every day, it seemed, the noose tightened a little more. Federal agents were gathering evidence, flipping associates, and planning for the day when they would bring the whole house down. And somewhere deep inside, both brothers must have known that a reckoning was coming. For now, they kept moving forward, each in his own way. Meech continued to project strength, hosting parties, appearing at clubs, keeping the image alive. Terry continued to refine the logistics, tightening operations, trying to stay one step ahead of the investigators. The machine kept running, but the tension between its two operators was now part of its rhythm, a steady undercurrent beneath every decision. And as the pressure mounted, the space between Meech and Terry grew wider, a quiet distance that would soon be tested in ways neither of them could have imagined. When the first big raids came, they landed like thunderclaps, shaking BMF to its core. For years, Meech and Terry had managed to stay one step ahead, carefully maneuvering around law enforcement and keeping their network tight. But no empire lasts forever, and the task force had been patient, slowly gathering the evidence they needed to make a real move. Now, they were ready to strike, and when they did, they struck hard. In one coordinated sweep, agents hit multiple stash houses across several states. Doors were kicked in before dawn, flashlights cut through dark hallways, and the quiet hum of money counters was replaced by the chaos of shouting officers and panicked crew members. In one house, they found duffel bags stuffed with cash, millions of dollars bundled neatly in vacuum-sealed bricks. In another, they found dozens of kilos of cocaine hidden behind false walls and inside furniture. Everywhere they looked, they found evidence of just how massive BMF had become. The news spread fast. By midday, phones were buzzing with word of the busts. Some crew members disappeared immediately, abandoning stash spots, leaving behind cars and even product in an attempt to get clear of the storm. Others stayed close to Meech, waiting for direction. The air was charged with fear and tension. Even for those who had seen arrests before, this felt different. This wasn't just one house getting hit. This was a message: the government was coming for them, and they were coming in force. Meech stayed calm, at least outwardly. He gathered his people, reassured them, told them that this was just part of the game. Raids happened. They had been through this before. What mattered was how they responded. But deep down, even Meech must have known that this was the beginning of something bigger. These raids weren't random. They were coordinated, precise, the kind of moves that suggested the feds were far along in building their case. Terry saw it as confirmation of everything he had been warning about. To him, the raids were proof that the time for pulling back had passed. Now it was time to get out completely, before it was too late. He urged Meech to shut everything down, to walk away while they still had the money and the freedom to do so. Meech listened, but he wasn't ready to abandon the empire he had built. In his mind, this was a setback, not the end. If they stayed disciplined, they could ride out the storm. The problem was that the storm wasn't slowing down. Each raid provided more evidence for the task force, more leads to follow. Arrested associates began to talk, trading information for lighter sentences. Wiretaps captured conversations that hinted at where the next shipments were going, who was holding what, and how the money was moving. Step by step, the case against BMF was becoming airtight. The raids also took a financial toll. Cash was seized in massive amounts, hitting BMF's liquidity and slowing down operations. Replacing product was expensive and dangerous, especially with increased surveillance on their supply lines. Drivers became more nervous, stash house managers more paranoid. Some even refused to keep product on hand for fear of being raided next. Despite the growing pressure, Meech tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. The parties continued, the cars still rolled out, and the BMF name was still shouted in clubs. But those closest to Meech could feel the difference. There was a weight in the air now, a tension that hadn't been there before. Every knock at the door made people flinch. Every phone call was second-guessed. For some, the fear became too much. A few members quietly left the organization, disappearing into other cities, changing numbers, cutting ties. Others stayed but with a look in their eyes that suggested they were counting the days until the inevitable. The raids had reminded everyone that no one was truly untouchable, not even BMF. Law enforcement, for their part, seemed almost methodical in their approach. They weren't trying to take everyone down at once, not yet. Instead, they were dismantling the organization piece by piece, hitting stash houses, seizing shipments, and watching to see how Meech and Terry would react. Every move BMF made in response gave the task force more information, more patterns to analyze. The brothers' relationship continued to strain under the pressure. Terry became more vocal about his desire to step away, even floating the idea of splitting from Meech entirely to focus on a quieter life. Meech resisted, still believing that they could outlast the heat if they just stayed smart. This difference of opinion created quiet tension that everyone around them could feel. Each new raid felt like another drumbeat in a slow march toward something final. The question was no longer if BMF would face a major takedown, it was when. And for all of Meech's calm and charisma, even he couldn't control the pace of what was coming. Still, there were moments of defiance. Meech wasn't the kind of man to hide in the shadows, even when the heat was unbearable. He continued to appear in public, to host events, to project the same image of strength and confidence that had always defined him. In some ways, it was a calculated move, a way of telling both his crew and his enemies that he was still in control. But those closest to him knew that the walls were closing in. The raids were just the beginning. What was coming next would be bigger, more coordinated, and harder to escape. For years, Meech had been the man who stayed 2 steps ahead of everyone, rivals, cops, and even fate itself. But now, the game was changing, and the next move might not be his to make. This was the beginning of the endgame, the moment when the empire Meech had built from the ground up began to feel less like an unshakable fortress and more like a house under siege. And as everyone waited for the next strike, a quiet question hung in the air: when the hammer finally fell, would anyone be left standing? When the raids became impossible to ignore and the arrests started stacking up, Meech knew the game had changed. This wasn't a storm he could simply wait out. The task force was no longer probing, they were closing in for the kill. For years, Meech had managed to stay ahead by thinking several moves forward, but now every move felt like it carried a new level of risk. The last days of his freedom became a careful dance, part strategy, part survival, part refusal to let go of the life he had built. Meech began moving constantly, never staying in one location for too long. Safe houses were rotated, meeting spots changed at the last minute, and trusted drivers were tasked with shuttling him from one place to another in carefully planned convoys. Sometimes he would switch vehicles mid-trip, slipping into a different car just to make sure he wasn't being followed. These precautions became second nature, a routine born of necessity. And yet, even as he moved like a man being hunted, Meech continued to live with the same calm confidence that had made him a legend. He still showed up to clubs, still threw parties, still projected the image of a man untouchable. For those watching him from the outside, it seemed as if nothing had changed. Meech was still Meech, still the boss, still smiling and shaking hands. But those closest to him could sense the difference. His eyes were sharper now, his movements more calculated. Every room he entered was scanned, every conversation measured. The pressure from law enforcement was relentless. Surveillance teams tracked his movements, sometimes following him across entire cities. Wiretaps picked up snippets of his conversations, coded as they were, giving investigators more threads to pull. Associates were questioned, some arrested, and a few flipped under pressure, offering information in exchange for lighter sentences. Meech knew that the circle was getting smaller, that every day brought him closer to the moment when they would come for him directly. Despite this, there were nights when Meech refused to let fear dictate his actions. He would host gatherings at safe houses, surrounded by friends and loyalists, music playing softly in the background. These weren't wild parties anymore, they were quieter affairs, more reflective. Perhaps Meech understood that these were moments to savor, that the freedom he had always taken for granted was slipping through his fingers. Terry, meanwhile, had begun to step further away, distancing himself both physically and philosophically. His desire to exit the game had only intensified, and the rift between the brothers grew wider with each passing week. For Terry, survival now meant separation, separating himself from Meech, from the public image, from the high-risk lifestyle that had defined BMF's rise. It was a painful decision, but one he felt was necessary if there was to be any chance of salvaging a future for himself and his family. Meech respected his brother's choice but refused to follow the same path. To Meech, stepping away felt like surrender, and surrender was never an option. He had built BMF with his own hands, turned it into something legendary, and he wasn't going to let it end quietly. If they were going to take him down, he was going to go out standing tall. This period of Meech's life was marked by a strange duality, part fugitive, part celebrity. He was a man on the run, yes, but also a man who refused to hide completely. Some nights he would sit in a mansion surrounded by silence, the weight of the investigation pressing down on him. Other nights he would roll out to a club with his entourage, moving through the crowd like royalty, reminding everyone that he was still the king of Atlanta's nightlife. Every decision carried risk. Every phone call could be tapped, every meeting could be under surveillance, every new face could be an informant. Meech had to rely on instincts honed over decades, knowing who to trust, when to speak, and when to stay silent. The paranoia was justified, but he refused to let it break him. Even under this intense pressure, Meech continued to look after his people. He made sure families of locked-up members were taken care of, that lawyers were paid, that those who remained loyal still had a reason to stay loyal. This sense of responsibility never left him, even as his own freedom grew more uncertain by the day. The tension during this time was almost cinematic. Federal agents were not just watching, they were waiting, building a case so tight that there would be no escape. Somewhere, Meech must have known that the clock was running out. And yet, he still moved with a kind of calm defiance, as though daring fate to catch him. There is a haunting image in this chapter of Meech's life, a man sitting in a darkened living room, the glow of city lights coming through the window, a glass of liquor in his hand. The house is quiet, save for the faint sound of traffic outside and the occasional vibration of a burner phone on the table. He leans back, deep in thought, perhaps reflecting on the journey that brought him here, from the cold streets of Detroit to the pinnacle of power, and now to the edge of something unknown. These were the last days when Meech could still choose where to go, when to move, when to speak. The net was almost closed, but for a brief moment, he still had room to breathe. And in that narrow space between freedom and capture, he lived as fully as he could, still a boss, still a legend, still believing, if only for a little while longer, that he could find a way to stay one step ahead. But inevitability has a way of catching up to even the smartest and calmest players. The task force was nearly ready. The evidence was in place, the indictments prepared, the plans for the final sweep being drawn up. The next time Meech heard that knock on the door, it wouldn't be a warning. It would be the moment when everything changed. The day it finally happened felt like the end of a long chase, a moment that had been building for years. Federal agents had been patient, deliberate, careful not to move too soon. They had their case now, the wiretaps, the surveillance photos, the seized cash and product, the cooperating witnesses. All of it had been pieced together into a picture so complete that there would be no escape. When the arrest order came down, it was as if the entire task force took a collective breath and then moved as one. It was just before dawn when the convoy of law enforcement vehicles rolled out. Black SUVs and unmarked sedans cut silently through the early morning. Streets, lights off, radios buzzing with quiet instructions. The air was heavy with tension, the kind that comes just before the strike. The agents knew exactly where Meech was staying. They had been watching for days, learning his patterns, waiting for the perfect moment when they could catch him off guard but without risking violence. Inside the house, it was quiet. The last of the night's music had faded hours earlier, and most of the crew had gone home. Meech was asleep, the calm before the storm unbroken. Then came the knock, heavy, deliberate, echoing through the house like a drumbeat. A pause, and then another. This wasn't the knock of a friend or a late-night visitor. Everyone inside knew instantly what it meant. Federal agents. Open the door. The stillness shattered in an instant. Lights snapped on, voices rose in confusion, feet pounded on the floors as people scrambled to figure out what was happening. Meech woke, took a breath, and for a brief moment, time seemed to slow. This was it, the moment he had been anticipating, the one that had been looming ever since the first raid. There was no running now, no clever move left to make. The storm had finally arrived at his door. When the agents breached the house, they moved quickly and with precision. Flashlights cut through the darkness, commands rang out, down. Hands where we can see them. As they swept room to room. Meech didn't resist. He wasn't the kind of man to go out in a blaze of chaos. Instead, he remained calm, composed even, as they placed the cuffs on his wrists. Witnesses later said that he was quiet, almost serene, as if he had already made peace with what was happening. Outside, the flashing lights of police vehicles bathed the neighborhood in red and blue. The scene was almost cinematic, Meech, the man who had been a king of the streets, walking out in handcuffs under the glow of dawn. Neighbors peered from windows, curious and afraid. For years, they had seen the convoys of cars, the parties, the security, and the quiet comings and goings of men who looked like they belonged in music videos. Now they were watching the empire's leader taken away. Word traveled fast. By mid-morning, news outlets were reporting the arrest, their headlines buzzing across television screens and early websites. Photos of Meech being led to a waiting vehicle spread quickly, a stark contrast to the images of him smiling in VIP sections, surrounded by celebrities. For his supporters, it was a shock. The man who had seemed larger than life was suddenly very human, standing silently in a chain of custody. For BMF, the arrest was an earthquake. Phones lit up across the country as members tried to figure out what it meant, who else might be next, and whether it was time to run. Some panicked, some stayed loyal, but everyone understood that this was no small bust. If they had Meech, they had been watching long enough to know almost everything. The empire, once so untouchable, now felt exposed. Meech was transported to a federal facility, where he was processed and placed into custody. The quiet of the cell was a stark contrast to the life he had been living. No music, no flashing lights, no cheering crowds, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the sound of metal doors closing. For a man who had built an empire, who had walked through life like a star, this was a moment of stillness that must have felt both surreal and final. Yet even here, Meech maintained the same calm that had defined him. Those who saw him in those first hours said he wasn't angry or panicked. He was thoughtful, reflective, almost as if he had been preparing for this day all along. Perhaps he had. Perhaps every late-night drive, every coded phone call, every glance over the shoulder had been leading to this, and now that it had come, there was nothing left to do but face it. Outside the prison walls, the story was just beginning. Prosecutors were preparing to unveil the full scope of their case. Reporters were digging into BMF's history, its reach, its ties to the music industry. Rappers mentioned Meech's name in hushed tones, some offering support, others distancing themselves. The public, fascinated by the rise and fall of outlaws, was eager for every detail. But for Meech, everything had gone quiet. The life he had built, the empire he had run, the legend he had created, all of it was now frozen in time. The day the music stopped wasn't marked by gunfire or betrayal, but by the calm click of handcuffs and the sound of a door closing behind him. This was the end of one chapter, but not the end of the story. What came next would play out in courtrooms, in headlines, and in the hearts of those who still believed in the dream he had sold. For now, Meech sat in silence, a man who had lived like a king now waiting to see what judgment the world would hand him. The trial of Demetrius, Big Meech, Flenory was more than just a criminal proceeding. It was a spectacle, the public unmasking of one of the most powerful underworld figures in modern American history. The courtroom became a stage where prosecutors, defense attorneys, and federal agents laid bare the inner workings of the Black Mafia family. What had once been hidden behind luxury cars, nightclubs, and coded conversations was now displayed under the cold fluorescent lights of justice. From the very first day, the media was there. Reporters filled the benches, cameras waited outside the courthouse, and every move Meech made was scrutinized. To some, he was a criminal mastermind who had poisoned communities with drugs; to others, he was a Robin Hood figure, a man who had risen from nothing to become a legend, someone who shared his wealth and inspired a generation. This tension, between villain and folk hero, hung over the entire trial, giving it a sense of drama that gripped the country. Meech arrived in court dressed sharply, as always. Even in custody, he carried himself with dignity, shoulders straight, expression calm. He was not the kind of defendant who slouched or hid from the cameras. If anything, he seemed to embrace the moment, knowing that all eyes were on him. When he entered the courtroom, people watched in silence. There was no shouting, no theatrics, just a quiet sense of gravity. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out their case. They had spent years building it, and now they were ready to show just how far BMF's reach had extended. Charts and diagrams were displayed for the jury, showing the network structure, suppliers at the top, distributors across the country, money couriers, stash house managers, and at the center of it all, Meech and his brother Terry. Wiretap transcripts were read aloud, voices of Meech's associates captured in conversations that, while coded, clearly pointed to drug shipments, money drops, and operational planning. Agents testified about the raids, the millions in cash seized, the kilos recovered, the cars with hidden compartments. Photos were shown of the lavish lifestyle, the mansions, the fleets of exotic cars, the designer clothes, all paid for, prosecutors argued, by drug money. Piece by piece, they painted a picture of an empire so large and so sophisticated that it rivaled international cartels. The defense worked tirelessly to counter this image. They argued that Meech was not the violent kingpin the government portrayed him to be. They highlighted the lack of direct evidence tying Meech personally to acts of violence. They pointed out that he had tried to legitimize himself through BMF entertainment, that he was a businessman who had simply become a target because of his success and visibility. They reminded the jury that Meech had inspired loyalty not through fear but through respect, that he had provided for countless people who might otherwise have been lost to poverty. For Meech, the trial must have been a surreal experience, to sit silently as others dissected his life, his choices, his very identity. There were moments when witnesses he once trusted took the stand against him, their testimony cutting deep. There were moments when the weight of the evidence was overwhelming, when even those loyal to him must have wondered how he could possibly escape conviction. And yet, Meech remained composed. He listened carefully, whispered with his attorneys, and kept his expression neutral. To those watching, it was as if he refused to give the prosecution the satisfaction of seeing him break. He was the same Meech who had stood calm in clubs filled with flashing cameras, the same Meech who had led one of the most disciplined organizations in the country. The trial lasted weeks, each day adding new layers of tension. The jury heard from cooperating witnesses, some of whom had once been close to the inner circle of BMF. Their testimony was damning, describing shipments worth millions, detailing coded phone calls, recounting meetings where product and cash exchanged hands. Prosecutors used these accounts to reinforce the wiretap evidence, building a case that seemed airtight. Outside the courthouse, supporters gathered, some wearing BMF shirts, others holding signs of encouragement. To them, Meech was still a hero, someone who had brought hope and excitement to their communities. They shouted his name as he was escorted in and out each day, a show of loyalty that mirrored the loyalty he had inspired during BMF's rise. As the trial drew to a close, the atmosphere grew heavy. Closing arguments were delivered with passion. The prosecution framed Meech as the architect of a criminal empire that had left destruction in its wake, an empire they argued needed to be dismantled completely to protect society. The defense countered by appealing to the humanity of the jury, reminding them that Meech was more than the charges against him, that he was a brother, a son, a man who had provided for others and who deserved to be seen in full, not just as a headline. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom fell silent. Hours stretched into a long, anxious wait. Meech sat quietly, his hands folded, his face unreadable. For all his confidence, this was the moment when his fate would be decided by strangers. It must have been a strange feeling for a man who had controlled so much of his life, who had dictated the flow of millions of dollars, who had commanded loyalty across the country, now sitting powerless, waiting for 12 people to decide whether he would spend decades behind bars. When the verdict finally came, the room was tense enough to hold its breath. The jury foreperson rose, the papers in hand, and began to read. Guilty. Count after count, the words landed like hammer blows. Meech did not flinch. He listened, nodded slightly, and then sat back. If he felt anger or fear, he did not show it. For the prosecutors, it was a victory years in the making. For law enforcement, it was the culmination of one of the most complex investigations in recent history. For Meech's supporters, it was a heartbreak, the fall of a man they had seen as larger than life. And for Meech himself, it was the closing of another chapter. The trial had been fought, the verdict rendered. Now all that remained was sentencing, the final word on just how high a price he would pay for the empire he had built. The courtroom was silent the morning Demetrius, Big Meech, Flenory returned to hear his sentence. The trial had been grueling, each day peeling back another layer of his empire, each witness a reminder of just how far the government had reached into the inner circle of BMF. The guilty verdict had already landed, heavy and unshakable, but sentencing day was different. This was the day when words on paper would become reality, when Meech would find out how many years of his life he would spend behind bars. The benches were packed with journalists, court observers, and supporters. Outside, cameras lined the courthouse steps, waiting to capture images of a man whose name had become synonymous with both power and controversy. To some, he was a criminal finally facing justice. To others, he was a fallen hero, a man who had given back to his community even as he broke the law. That tension hung in the air like static electricity, giving the entire room a strange, almost reverent quiet. Meech entered the courtroom in his khaki prison uniform, his wrists cuffed, his posture straight. He was calm, as he had been throughout the entire trial. His face betrayed nothing, no fear, no anger, no visible regret. It was the same composure he had carried through his rise, his reign, and his downfall. He took his seat next to his attorneys, nodded once, and then looked straight ahead. When the judge entered, everyone rose, and the room seemed to hold its collective breath. The judge began by acknowledging the scale of the case. This was not a small-time operation, he reminded the court. This was a drug empire that had stretched across the country, generating hundreds of millions of dollars and flooding communities with cocaine. The government had spent years investigating it, and now it was time to impose a sentence that reflected the scope of the crimes. The prosecution spoke first, laying out their recommendation. They asked for a sentence that would send a message, not just to Meech, but to anyone who might try to replicate what he had built. They described the damage cocaine had done to countless lives, the violence that had followed in the wake of the drug trade, and the need for a punishment severe enough to deter future empires. Their words were clinical, precise, meant to strip away the aura of legend and focus on the hard reality of the crimes. Then came the defense. They argued for leniency, painting a fuller picture of the man sitting before the court. They spoke of Meech's generosity, of the people he had supported, of the lives he had helped, of his efforts to go legitimate through BMF entertainment. They asked the judge to see him not just as a criminal but as a man capable of redemption, someone who could one day contribute positively to society if given the chance. When Meech was given the chance to speak, he rose slowly, his chains rattling softly. He did not make excuses or beg for mercy. Instead, he spoke with a calm, measured voice, thanking his family, his supporters, and even the court. He acknowledged that mistakes had been made, that choices had consequences, but he did so without self-pity. Those present said there was a quiet dignity in his words, as though he had accepted that this, too, was part of the life he had chosen. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The judge looked down from the bench, his voice steady as he read the sentence, 30 years in federal prison. The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before settling like a weight on the room. There were quiet gasps from some in the gallery. Family members lowered their heads. Supporters shifted uncomfortably, some shaking their heads in disbelief. 30 years. For a man already in his mid-30s, it might as well have been a lifetime. Meech stood still as the sentence was read, his face unchanged. No visible shock, no visible anger, only that same steady calm that had followed him through every step of this journey. When the judge finished, Meech nodded slightly, as if to say he understood. Outside the courthouse, the news spread quickly. Headlines blared the sentence across the country: BMF boss sentenced to 30 years. Hip-hop blogs lit up with reactions. Some artists posted messages of support, others wrote lyrics in tribute, cementing Meech's legend even as he was led away in chains. For many, the sentence only added to his myth, a king brought low but never broken. Back inside, deputies approached to escort Meech out. As he turned to leave, he glanced briefly toward the gallery where family and loyal supporters sat. It was not a long look, but those who saw it would remember it, a final silent acknowledgement, a reminder that even now, he was still the leader they had followed for so long. As the heavy doors closed behind him, the reality set in. This was the end of the life he had known, the end of the freedom he had fought so hard to maintain. From now on, Meech's world would be measured in prison walls, in counts of days and years, in phone calls and visits from the outside. The man who had once moved through nightclubs like a celebrity would now move through a cell block like every other inmate. And yet, even as he was led away, there was a sense that the story was not truly over. The legend of Big Meech had not been extinguished by the sentence. If anything, it had been amplified. The world would keep talking about him, keep debating his legacy, keep remembering the rise and fall of the man who had built BMF from nothing. For Meech, sentencing day was the moment when his fate was sealed. The empire was gone, the dream was over, but the myth was just beginning. History would remember this day as the moment a king fell, but also as the moment that turned him from a man into a legend. The first days behind bars are always the hardest. For Demetrius, Big Meech, Flenory, a man who had once lived in mansions, driven fleets of exotic cars, and held court in nightclubs surrounded by flashing lights, the starkness of a prison cell must have been jarring. Gone were the marble floors and endless rooms, replaced by concrete walls, a narrow bed, and the constant hum of fluorescent lights. The sounds of music and laughter were replaced by the distant clank of doors and the echo of shouted roll calls. And yet, Meech adapted. If there was one thing his life had taught him, it was how to stay calm under pressure, how to survive when the environment turned hostile. He approached prison the way he had approached the streets, with discipline, patience, and a long-term view. He knew that losing his freedom didn't mean losing his identity. Inside, Meech quickly established a presence. He wasn't the kind of man to bully or posture, he didn't need to. His reputation had preceded him. Inmates and even guards knew who he was, and that carried weight. Many respected him not just for what he had built on the outside but for the way he carried himself now, still calm, still composed, still exuding the quiet authority that had made him a leader. Prison life is its own ecosystem, with its own rules and hierarchies, but Meech was no stranger to structure. He treated his time inside like a new kind of hustle, one where the currency wasn't money but respect, patience, and mental clarity. He stayed away from unnecessary drama, avoided conflicts when he could, and focused on keeping his mind sharp. Letters began to flow in from the outside, from family, from friends, from fans who had been following his story for years. Some wrote to thank him for inspiring them, others to share how his story had changed their lives. For Meech, these letters were lifelines, reminders that the world hadn't forgotten him. Phone calls became moments of connection, opportunities to check in on loved ones and offer guidance. Even from behind bars, Meech remained a mentor. He spoke to younger inmates about staying focused, about thinking beyond the moment, about finding ways to better themselves even in confinement. To some, it was surprising to see a man who had once ruled the streets now encouraging education and discipline. But Meech understood that leadership wasn't just about power, it was about leaving something behind that mattered. BMF's name didn't disappear with Meech's incarceration. In many ways, it grew louder. Rappers continued to shout out BMF in their songs, documentaries, and articles explored the rise and fall of the empire, and Meech's legend began to take on a mythic quality. People spoke of him with a mixture of awe and nostalgia, as if remembering a time when the streets had been ruled by someone larger than life. Meech himself leaned into this legacy carefully. He gave interviews through written correspondence, speaking about his story in a way that was measured and reflective. He didn't glorify the violence or the drugs, but he didn't deny who he had been either. He told his story as a cautionary tale, a way to show young people that while the street dream might look glamorous, it often ends in prison cells or graves. Physically, Meech worked to stay strong. He followed routines, exercise, reading, meditation, anything that kept him disciplined and focused. He knew that prison had a way of breaking men, of making them lose themselves in despair or rage. He refused to let that happen to him. Every day became a quiet act of defiance, a way of saying that while they had taken his freedom, they had not taken his will. Over the years, Meech built connections with other inmates, some of whom were drawn to him not because of his fame, but because of his ability to stay steady in a place that often thrives on chaos. He became a source of advice, someone others could turn to when they needed perspective. It was as if the role he had played on the outside, the calm leader, the one who kept things together, had simply shifted into a new setting. There were hard days, of course. Days when the weight of decades in prison felt unbearable, when the thought of missing years of life outside hit hard. Birthdays passed, family milestones came and went, and Meech could only be part of them through letters and phone calls. But even then, he found ways to keep his spirit alive. He reminded himself that time was something he could use to grow, to reflect, to prepare for the day when he would eventually walk free again. Meech's incarceration also became part of hip-hop's ongoing mythology. Rappers referenced him in lyrics, TV shows dramatized his life, and fans kept his name alive on social media. For a man who had built a brand as powerful as BMF, this was a strange kind of immortality. His legend not only survived prison, it thrived there. There is something quietly powerful about this chapter of Meech's life. In the silence of a cell, stripped of all the things that once defined him, he found a different kind of strength. The world had seen him as a king of the streets, a man who lived like a rap star, but now he was showing that true power comes from within, from the ability to endure, to stay disciplined, to keep believing in yourself even when the world seems determined to break you. Years passed this way, one day after another, the rhythm of prison life steady and unchanging. And through it all, Meech remained a figure of fascination on the outside, a name that meant something far beyond the walls that held him. He had become more than a man, he had become a symbol, of ambition, of loyalty, of the price that comes with chasing a dream too far. When Meech was led away in chains and sentenced to 3 decades behind bars, many assumed that the story of the Black Mafia family would end there. But BMF was never just a business, it had become a symbol, a culture, something larger than the sum of its parts. Even as the leadership was locked away, the name lived on, whispered in the streets, shouted in lyrics, and remembered by those who had seen its rise firsthand. The immediate aftermath of Meech's sentencing was chaotic. Without his steady hand at the top, BMF began to splinter. Some members tried to keep operations running, but the constant pressure from law enforcement made it nearly impossible. Raids continued, more arrests followed, and the once tight network began to unravel. Those who remained loyal to the Flenory brothers were forced to lay low, to protect what little was left of the organization and avoid the feds who were still looking for loose ends to tie up. For others, loyalty gave way to self-preservation. A few disappeared altogether, vanishing into other cities or other lives. Some cooperated with law enforcement, testifying in exchange for reduced sentences. The once unbreakable circle of trust was fractured, and with it, the machinery of BMF ground to a halt. And yet, despite the collapse of the empire, the legend of BMF only seemed to grow stronger. On the streets, stories of their rise took on almost mythical proportions. People spoke about the convoys of black SUVs, the nights when Meech would spend $100,000 in a club without blinking, the way BMF shirts became a badge of status. For those who had lived through it, those years were unforgettable, a time when it felt like anything was possible, when two brothers from Detroit had turned the underworld into a kingdom. The music industry played a major role in keeping the name alive. Rappers who had once been associated with BMF, and even those who had only admired them from a distance, continued to reference Meech and his crew in their songs. Each shout-out was a reminder that BMF wasn't just a criminal organization, it was part of the culture, a symbol of ambition, hustle, and living large. Television and film eventually picked up the story too. Documentaries were made, interviews were given, and eventually, a scripted series brought the tale of BMF to a whole new generation. These portrayals often walked a careful line, showing the glamour and the power while also showing the cost, the arrests, the betrayals, the years lost behind bars. But regardless of the angle, they ensured that BMF's name remained in the public consciousness. For Meech, watching this from inside must have been bittersweet. On one hand, his dream of making BMF a name that would live forever had been realized. People who had never met him, never set foot in Detroit or Atlanta, knew his story. On the other hand, it was a reminder of everything he had lost, the freedom to live the life he had built, the ability to move through the world as he pleased. The hip-hop community in particular embraced Meech as a kind of folk hero. Lyrics celebrated him as a man who had lived without compromise, who had taken the street dream as far as it could go. For some, he became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when the dream ends in a courtroom. For others, he remained a symbol of resistance, of what it meant to rise above circumstances and build something massive from nothing. Even in the neighborhoods where BMF had once operated, the memory lingered. Older heads would tell stories to the younger generation, recounting the days when Meech and Terry were building their empire, when the streets were buzzing with energy, when the sight of a line of black trucks pulling up to a club meant that the night was about to turn legendary. These stories became part of the oral history of the streets, passed down like folklore. The absence of BMF also left a vacuum. Other crews tried to fill the space, but none had the same combination of organization, discipline, and charisma. Violence flared in some cities as rival groups fought over territory that had once been tightly controlled. Without BMF's centralized leadership, the drug trade became more fragmented, more chaotic, and in some places, more dangerous. For law enforcement, the dismantling of BMF was considered a major victory. Press conferences were held, agents and prosecutors congratulated one another on a job well done. But even they acknowledged, sometimes grudgingly, that BMF had been one of the most disciplined organizations they had ever faced. Their respect for Meech and Terry's strategic minds was clear, even as they celebrated their convictions. As the years passed, the legend of BMF became less about the day-to-day operations of the drug empire and more about what it represented, a vision of ambition, loyalty, and the price of power. It became a story about two brothers who turned a dream into reality, who built an empire from scratch, and who paid the ultimate price for it. For those who had been close to Meech, the aftermath was a time of reflection. Some spoke about the lessons they had learned, about the importance of discipline and unity, about the need to think beyond the moment. Others simply remembered the good times, the nights when the world seemed theirs for the taking. In this way, BMF never truly died. The name became a symbol, the kind that outlives the people who started it. Meech may have been locked away, Terry may have stepped back, but the initials, BMF, still carried meaning. They stood for ambition, for the dream of rising above, for the idea that even those from the roughest neighborhoods could leave a mark so big it could never be erased. And so, even as the streets changed, even as new names and new players came and went, BMF remained a ghost that haunted the culture, a reminder of what had been, and a question about what might come next when Meech one day walked free again. Looking back on the story of Demetrius, Big Meech, Flenory, it is impossible not to feel the weight of its lessons. This is a story that begins with two brothers on the streets of Detroit, selling small bags to survive, and grows into a saga about ambition, loyalty, power, and the price of chasing a dream too far. It is a story of rise and fall, of glamour and consequence, of what happens when a vision becomes so big it can no longer be contained by the world around it. One of the first lessons is about ambition. Meech was never content to settle. From the earliest days, he saw the hustle not as an end in itself but as a stepping stone to something greater. His ability to think beyond the corner, to imagine a network that stretched across states, was what made BMF possible. It's easy to look at his story and see only the criminal enterprise, but at its core, this was also a story about vision, about someone who refused to let his environment define him, someone who turned an idea into a movement. There is also a lesson about discipline. BMF was not successful because of luck. It thrived because it was organized, because Meech and Terry built a structure that ran with precision. For years, they operated under the radar, keeping violence to a minimum, focusing on efficiency, and staying ahead of law enforcement. This discipline was what allowed them to rise so high, and it is a reminder that even in a world outside the law, success still requires strategy, patience, and control. But perhaps the most profound lesson is about limits, about knowing when enough is enough. If there is a tragic thread running through Meech's story, it is that he could not walk away. Even when the money was more than enough, even when the warning signs were everywhere, he kept pushing, kept building, kept believing he could stay ahead forever. This is where ambition becomes dangerous, where the hunger that drives a man to greatness also leads him to risk losing everything. Loyalty is another theme woven deeply into this story. Meech inspired a level of loyalty that was rare. People followed him not just because he paid them well, but because he treated them with respect, because he made them feel part of something larger. That kind of leadership is powerful, and it's why BMF lasted as long as it did. But loyalty also has a price. When the indictments came, when the pressure mounted, loyalty was tested. Some stayed silent, others cooperated with law enforcement. It is a reminder that loyalty in the underworld is always conditional, always at risk when survival is on the line. There is also a lesson about image, about the power and the danger of projecting a persona. Meech's decision to embrace the spotlight turned BMF into a brand, made them into something legendary. But it also made them more visible to law enforcement, more vulnerable to scrutiny. In many ways, the same image that made Meech a cultural icon helped build the case that brought him down. It's a paradox. The very thing that made him untouchable in the eyes of the streets made him an irresistible target in the eyes of the government. For listeners, this story offers a chance to reflect not just on Meech's choices but on the nature of ambition itself. How far would you go to achieve your dream? How much risk would you take? And at what point would you be willing to walk away? These are questions that go beyond the criminal world, questions that apply to business, to art, to life itself. There is also something deeply human about Meech's journey. Strip away the headlines, the money, the drugs, and what you have is a man who wanted to be remembered, who wanted to create something bigger than himself. That desire, to matter, to leave a mark, is universal. We all want to be seen, to be known, to be remembered. Meech achieved that, though at a cost few would be willing to pay. His story is also a reminder of the dual nature of power. It can inspire, uplift, and create opportunities, but it can also corrupt, isolate, and eventually destroy. The higher you climb, the more fragile your position becomes, the more enemies you attract, the more you have to lose. In the end, Meech's fall was as dramatic as his rise, and perhaps that is why his story continues to captivate so many. As you think about this journey, from Detroit corners to nationwide fame, from nightclub lights to the quiet of a prison cell, there is a calm lesson hidden within it. Every choice carries weight. Every ambition carries a cost. Meech's story does not glorify crime so much as it shows the full arc of what happens when you live by the hustle. There is glamour, yes, but there is also sacrifice, and sooner or later, there is a reckoning. And yet, there is also redemption in the way Meech has carried himself since. He has used his time to reflect, to mentor, to speak on the lessons he has learned. He has not vanished from the world, he has found a way to keep inspiring others, even from behind bars. That, too, is part of his legacy. This section of the story is about slowing down, about breathing, about taking in everything we have just heard. It is about seeing Meech not just as a gangster or a cultural figure, but as a man, complex, flawed, brilliant, and human. Night has fallen again, and somewhere far from the streets of Detroit or the clubs of Atlanta, Demetrius, Big Meech, Flenory sits quietly in a prison cell. The world outside continues to move, seasons pass, music evolves, and new names rise and fall in the headlines. But Meech remains, living each day with the steady rhythm of prison life. And yet, his story is anything but forgotten. In many ways, Meech has become even larger in absence than he was in presence. The legend of BMF has taken on a life of its own. Television series dramatize his rise, rap lyrics still shout his name, and interviews with those who knew him are shared with fascination. For a whole new generation, Meech is not just a figure of the past, he is a symbol, a name that represents ambition, loyalty, and the price of living at the edge of the dream. There is something haunting about this kind of immortality. It is as if Meech exists in two worlds at once, the real world of concrete walls and locked doors, and the imagined world where he is still stepping out of black SUVs, still smiling under club lights, still raising glasses of champagne with his crew. The man is confined, but the myth roams free, untouched by bars or time. On some nights, perhaps Meech sits in the quiet of his cell, replaying memories in his mind, the first deals on Detroit corners, the early mornings counting cash in hidden rooms, the sight of hundreds of people wearing BMF shirts, the feeling of being at the center of a movement. These memories must be bittersweet now, a reminder of what he built and what it cost him. And yet, there is also a strange sense of victory hidden in the quiet. Meech had always wanted BMF to be remembered, to be more than just a name whispered in back alleys. He wanted it to be a brand, a symbol that would outlive the moment. In that, he succeeded. Long after the last shipment moved, long after the last dollar was counted, BMF lives on, not as an organization, but as a story. For those listening tonight, that story has taken us across decades, from the struggling neighborhoods of Detroit to the glittering nights of Atlanta, from the rise of an empire to the silence of a courtroom. We have seen the ambition that built BMF, the loyalty that sustained it, the pressure that broke it, and the reflection that followed its fall. As the lights dim in this final chapter, there is a calm reminder here, every legend has two sides. There is the shining surface, the cars, the money, the parties, and there is the shadow beneath it, the risks, the fear, the price that must be paid. Meech's life reminds us that power and consequence are always intertwined, that you cannot have one without eventually facing the other. And yet, there is also something undeniably inspiring about his journey. He took nothing and turned it into something so massive that the world could not ignore it. He gave people a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, even if it came with danger. He showed that vision and discipline could create something that felt unshakable, even if only for a time. The streets still remember him. Even now, years later, there are those who tell stories of the nights BMF lit up Atlanta, of the times Meech made the club feel like the center of the universe, of the way he treated people with respect even as he lived like a star. These stories keep the name alive, passing it from one generation to the next, turning it into something more than history, something closer to folklore. And perhaps that is the final note of this story, not tragedy, not triumph, but legacy. Meech may serve his time, he may grow older behind those walls, but when the world speaks of the great empires of the street, his name will always be there. The legend of Big Meech has become part of the culture, part of the music, part of the endless fascination with those who dare to live big, no matter the cost. As we close this long journey, imagine one last scene, Meech sitting on his bunk, the faint light from the hallway casting shadows on the walls. In his hands, a letter from the outside, words of support reminding him that he has not been forgotten. Somewhere beyond those walls, a song plays in a car, his name in the lyrics, his story reaching someone who wasn't even alive when BMF ruled the streets. The world moves on, but it still carries his memory. The night grows quieter now. The sound of keys jangling down the hall fades, the prison settles into stillness. And in that stillness, the legend of Big Meech breathes on, not loud, not flashing, but steady, like a story that refuses to be silenced. As you drift into sleep, let this story settle around you. It is not just the story of a man who rose and fell, but of the choices that shape all of our lives. Ambition, loyalty, risk, reward, and the calm acceptance that every action has its echo. Meech's life was a storm, but here, in the quiet of reflection, it becomes something else, a reminder that even in the harshest endings, there can still be meaning, still be memory, still be a kind of peace. And so, the music fades. The lights dim. The story closes like a book placed gently on a nightstand. The legend lives on, waiting for the next time someone speaks his name, waiting for the next person to wonder how two brothers from Detroit built an empire so big it could never be forgotten.